I was 16 years old, the night my life changed forever. It was the kind of night when the prairie wind howled so loudly it rattled the wooden walls of our farmhouse. The lantern on the kitchen table flickered with every gust, throwing long, trembling shadows across the room. Outside, winter was settling in early, and the cold had already begun creeping into the cracks of the house. I remember standing near the doorway, holding a small canvas bag against my chest. My heart was beating so loudly that it felt like everyone in the room could hear it. My stepfather stood at the table, his face red with anger. His large hands were clenched into fists as he stared at me like I was some kind of problem that needed to be thrown away. "You've caused enough trouble in this house," he said, his voice low but sharp. "You're not staying here another night." For a moment, I didn't understand what he meant. I thought maybe he was angry. Maybe he wanted me to go outside for a while. Maybe he just wanted to scare me. But then he stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the wooden floor, and the sound sent a chill through my spine. My mother sat at the table beside him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes were fixed on the floorboards. She didn't look at me. She didn't say a word. That silence hurt more than anything my stepfather could have said. "Pack your things," he continued, "and leave." The words felt unreal, like they belonged to someone else's life, not mine. "Where would I go?" I asked quietly. He didn't hesitate. "That's not my problem." My throat tightened, and I looked at my mother again, hoping, begging for her to say something. Even a small protest would have meant the world to me. But she just kept staring at the floor. Something inside my chest broke right then. I slowly walked to my small room and packed the few things I owned. It didn't take long. My life was simple, and there wasn't much to gather. 2 dresses, a blanket, a pair of worn gloves, and a small tin box hidden beneath my bed. That tin box held the only thing my real father had left me before he died. $200. He had saved it little by little during the years he worked the fields. My mother had always told me it was meant for my future. At the time, I had imagined using it for school, or maybe to start a small shop one day. I never imagined it might be the only thing standing between me and starvation. I slipped the tin box into my coat pocket and returned to the kitchen. My stepfather didn't even look surprised that I was ready so quickly. He stood up and walked to the door. Then he opened it. The wind burst inside the house like a living thing. Cold air filled the room instantly, carrying the smell of snow and frozen grass. "Go," he said. For a moment, I stood frozen in place. This house had been my home since I was a little girl. Every memory I had lived inside these walls. Now I was being pushed out into the dark, like I didn't belong here anymore. I turned toward my mother one last time. "Mom?" My voice was barely louder than the wind. She didn't answer. She didn't even lift her head. That was when I realized something painful. She wasn't going to stop this. No one was. So I stepped outside. The cold hit my face like a slap. Snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked off the porch and onto the dirt road. Behind me, the door slammed shut. The sound echoed across the empty prairie. I stood there for a moment, staring at the house. Part of me believed the door might open again. Maybe my mother would run outside. Maybe she would call my name. Maybe she would tell me to come back inside. But the house remained dark and silent. Finally, I turned and started walking. The road stretched out ahead of me, disappearing into the night. The sky above was filled with cold stars, and the wind moved endlessly across the open land. I had never realized how big the prairie truly was until that moment. It felt endless, lonely, and terrifying. Every step I took made the distance between me and my old life a little larger. The cold quickly began seeping through my coat, and my fingers turned numb inside my gloves. But I kept walking. Stopping wasn't an option. On the prairie, standing still in winter could mean freezing to death. So I walked, and walked, and walked. Hours passed. The wind never stopped howling. Sometimes it felt like it was trying to push me backward, like the land itself didn't want me there. At one point I nearly tripped over a frozen patch of ground and fell to my knees. For a moment I stayed there, breathing hard, my heart pounding. That was when the tears finally came. Not loud sobbing, just quiet tears sliding down my cheeks. I wiped them away quickly. Crying didn't solve anything, and I couldn't afford to feel weak out there. Eventually the sky began turning gray with the first light of morning. The darkness slowly faded, revealing miles of frozen prairie stretching in every direction. My legs ached terribly, and my shoulders felt heavy from carrying my bag. But when the sun finally rose above the horizon, something unexpected happened. The golden light spread across the land, turning the frozen grass into a sea of shimmering silver. It was beautiful, strangely beautiful, and for the first time since leaving the house, I stopped feeling like the world had ended. Maybe my life wasn't over. Maybe it was just beginning in a way I never expected. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the tin box. Father had left me. I stared at the money for a long moment. $200 wasn't much. But out here, it might be enough to start something. Enough to survive. Enough to build a future. I didn't know exactly how yet. But one thought slowly formed in my mind. If no one was going to give me a home, then I would build one myself, right there on the open prairie. Even if no one believed I could do it. Even if the world laughed at the idea. Because at 16 years old, with nothing but a small bag and $200, I had already learned the most important lesson of my life. Sometimes the only person who can save you is yourself. And that was the moment the real story began. By the time the sun finished rising that morning, my legs felt like they belonged to someone else. I had walked almost the entire night, and the cold had drained whatever strength I had left. The prairies stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of pale grass frozen under a thin layer of snow. There were no houses, no smoke from chimneys, no fences, just empty land and the sound of the wind moving across it. I remember stopping beside a patch of tall grass that had somehow survived the frost. My breath came out in thick clouds, and my hands were shaking slightly from exhaustion. For the first time since leaving home, fear truly settled into my chest. Where exactly was I going? I had left without a destination. The road I had been following slowly faded into little more than a trail, and eventually even that disappeared beneath the snow. I sat down on a flat rock near a small frozen creek. The ice covering the water cracked softly as the current moved underneath it. The sound reminded me that time was moving forward, whether I was ready or not. I pulled the tin box from my pocket again. $200. I counted it slowly, even though I already knew the amount. $20 bills, $10 bills, a few smaller notes my father must have added near the end. It didn't look like much, but out here, it was everything I had. My stomach growled quietly. I hadn't eaten since the evening before. The truth was beginning to settle in. If I didn't figure something out soon, the cold and hunger might finish what my stepfather had started. That was when I remembered something my father used to say. He had loved the prairie in a way most people didn't understand. While others complained about the wind or the hard soil, he used to say the land was generous if you respected it. One summer afternoon, years earlier, he had pointed toward a strange little house made of thick brown blocks. I had asked him what it was. A sod house, he said. Back then I laughed, because it looked like someone had stacked pieces of dirt into a square. But my father had smiled, and said something that suddenly came rushing back to me that morning beside the frozen creek. Out here, if you can't build with wood, you build with earth. I slowly lifted my eyes and looked around. The ground beneath the prairie grass was thick with roots. Tough, tangled roots that held the soil together like rope. Farmers sometimes cut those roots into large blocks and stacked them like bricks. That meant the prairie itself could become walls. Walls that blocked wind, walls that held warmth. My heart started beating faster. Could I actually do that? Could I really build a house by myself? The idea sounded impossible, but the alternative was worse. The alternative was sleeping outside, and I knew the prairie winter wouldn't show mercy. I stood up slowly and walked across the field, studying the ground the way my father used to. The grass here was dense. The soil underneath felt thick and solid when I pushed the heel of my boot into it. Nearby, the small creek curved gently through the land. Water. That meant I could drink, and maybe trap animals later if I learned how. For the first time since leaving home, I felt something different than fear. I felt possibility. But before I could start building anything, I needed tools, and that meant walking to town. The nearest town was nearly 5 miles away, and by the time I reached it, the sun was already beginning to sink toward the horizon again. Everyone noticed strangers. So when a tired 16-year-old girl walked down the main dirt road, carrying a bag, and looking like she had slept outside, people noticed. Some stared openly, others whispered. I tried not to look at them as I pushed open the door to the general store. A small bell rang above the door as I stepped inside. The warmth hit my face instantly, and for a moment I nearly cried from relief. A few men sat near a small iron stove in the corner, drinking coffee and talking quietly. Their conversation stopped the moment they saw me. The store owner stood behind the counter, a thin man with gray hair and round spectacles. He studied me carefully. "You all right, miss?" he asked. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure that was true. "I need some tools." "What kind?" "A shovel," I said, "and an axe." He raised one eyebrow slightly. "That's serious work for someone your age." I didn't answer. Instead, I placed the tin box on the counter and opened it. The sight of real money changed the way people looked at me. He walked over and pulled a shovel from the rack near the wall. "Not a fancy one, just a strong iron blade with a wooden handle." $25, he said. I nodded. Next came the axe. 18. Then my eyes noticed something leaning against the back wall. An old iron stove. Small, rusty, but still solid. "Does that stove work?" I asked. The men near the fire chuckled quietly. "Works fine," the store owner said. "Someone traded it for flour last winter." "How much?" He thought for a moment. $30. I hesitated only a second before agreeing. Without heat, even a sod house wouldn't save me. When the total was counted, I had spent $73. That left me with $127. The men near the stove were watching me closely now. One of them finally spoke. "You're building something out there?" I took a deep breath. "Yes." "What?" "A sod house." The store went completely silent. Then someone laughed. A deep, booming laugh that filled the room. "You," another man said, "you're going to build a sod house alone?" Even the store owner looked skeptical. "You know that takes hundreds of blocks of earth," he said carefully. I nodded. "I know." Another man shook his head slowly. "You won't last a week out there." Maybe he believed he was telling the truth. Maybe he even felt sorry for me. But I had already made up my mind. I paid for the tools, lifted the shovel and axe, and strapped the small stove onto a wooden sled the store owner let me borrow. As I stepped outside, the cold evening wind hit my face again. Behind me, I heard the men still talking quietly, probably betting how long I would survive. I didn't look back. Instead, I began pulling the sled across the snow toward the empty land near the creek. The land no one wanted. The land people said couldn't support a real home. But as the sun disappeared below the horizon and the sky turned deep purple, I looked out across the frozen prairie and felt something powerful growing inside me. Determination. Because if the world believed I couldn't survive out there, then I was going to prove them wrong. One sod block at a time. And I had no idea yet that the strange little house I was about to build would one day become something people traveled miles just to see. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. The prairie was completely silent, except for the wind brushing across the frozen grass. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then, the cold air against my face reminded me. I was alone. No house, no family, just an open field, a shovel, an axe, and a rusty iron stove sitting beside a small pile of supplies. The land looked even bigger in the daylight. Standing there in the pale morning light, I suddenly realized how impossible my plan sounded. Building a house was something grown men struggled with, and here I was, 16 years old, planning to do it alone. A small voice inside my head whispered that maybe the men in town were right. Maybe I wouldn't last a week. Maybe I should turn around and go back, apologize, beg for forgiveness. But another thought quickly pushed that one away. If I went back, my stepfather would only throw me out again, and this time I might not have the strength to leave. So I picked up the shovel. My father's voice echoed in my memory as clearly as if he were standing beside me. "Cut the sod in rectangles," he used to say when explaining how prairie houses were built. "Let the grass roots hold the soil together." I pushed the shovel into the ground. The blade barely moved. The prairie soil was tougher than I expected. Years of thick grass roots had woven themselves together beneath the surface, forming something closer to rope than dirt. I pressed harder. The shovel sank deeper with a dull cracking sound. Then I cut another line, and another. Soon I had formed a rough rectangle in the earth, but getting the block out of the ground was another challenge entirely. I shoved the shovel underneath and leaned my full weight against the handle. The sod lifted slightly. Then it fell back into place. I tried again. This time it moved. With a final heave, the block finally broke free from the ground. I stared at it for a moment in disbelief. The block was thick and heavy, nearly 2 feet long and maybe a foot wide. The grass roots held everything together like a natural net. I bent down and tried to lift it. The weight shocked me. It felt like lifting a sack of grain, nearly 50 pounds. I dragged the sod block toward the spot where I planned to build the house. Each step left a deep trail in the snow. When I finally dropped the block onto the ground, my arms were already trembling. And that was just the first one. I sat down in the grass for a moment, breathing hard. A sudden realization hit me. If one block weighed this much, and a house needed hundreds, this was going to take far longer than I imagined. But quitting now meant sleeping outside all winter. So I stood up again. The work quickly became a rhythm. Cut, lift, drag, stack, again and again. The morning passed slowly as the sun climbed higher into the sky. By midday, my gloves were soaked with sweat and dirt. Blisters had already begun forming on my palms. I ignored them. The first row of sod blocks formed a rough rectangle on the ground. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. 10 feet long, 12 feet wide, small enough to build alone, but large enough to live inside. When the first row was finished, I started the second. Sod houses worked like brick buildings. Each layer of blocks rested on top of the one below it, forming thick walls that could stand against wind and snow. As the walls slowly grew higher, I began to understand why prairie settlers built them this way. The sod was dense, heavy, solid. By late afternoon, the walls had reached nearly 2 feet high. My arms felt like they were made of stone. My back ached with every movement. When the sun began sinking toward the horizon, I finally collapsed beside the half-finished wall. I stared at the work I had done that day. It wasn't much, just a low border of earth blocks surrounding a patch of frozen ground. But to me, it looked like something incredible. It looked like hope. The next few days followed the same exhausting routine. Wake up at sunrise, cut sod blocks, carry them, stack them, repeat until the sky turned dark. My hands blistered badly. At one point the skin on my palm tore open, leaving a painful red cut. I wrapped it with cloth from the bottom of my dress and kept working. The wind made everything harder. Sometimes it blew dirt into my eyes while I was cutting the sod. Other times it pushed against the blocks as I carried them, threatening to knock them from my arms. But slowly, the walls began to rise. 3 feet, then 4, then 5. The higher they grew, the more real the house started to feel. I left a small opening on one side for a door. Another smaller opening would become a window later. One afternoon, while lifting a particularly heavy block, my arms finally gave out. The sod slipped from my hands and crashed onto my foot. Pain shot through my leg instantly. I fell backward into the grass, gasping. For several minutes, I just lay there, staring up at the gray sky. That was the closest I came to quitting. My entire body hurt. My stomach was empty. And the wind never seemed to stop blowing. Tears filled my eyes as frustration finally broke through my determination. "What am I doing?" I whispered to myself. But then I turned my head and looked at the walls. 5 feet high now, a real structure rising from the earth, something I had built with my own hands. Slowly, I pushed myself back to my feet. I picked up the shovel again, because every block I stacked brought me one step closer to survival. After 2 weeks of relentless work, the walls were finally finished. They stood nearly 6 feet high, but the house still needed a roof. That part frightened me more than anything else. Without a roof, the first snowstorm would fill the entire house with ice. I walked along the creek, searching for fallen branches strong enough to hold weight. One by one, I carried them back to the house. Using rope and strips of cloth, I tied the branches together across the top of the walls. Then I layered grass over the wooden frame. Finally, I covered everything with a thick layer of sod and dirt. From the outside, the structure looked strange, more like a grassy hill than a house. But when I stepped inside for the first time, I felt something incredible. Shelter. Real shelter. The walls blocked the wind almost completely. The small space inside held the warmth of my body. I carefully carried the iron stove inside and set it near the corner. That night, when I lit the first fire inside my sod house, the orange glow of the flames reflected softly off the dirt walls. The warmth slowly spread through the tiny room. I sat beside the stove, wrapped in my blanket, staring at the walls around me. For the first time since the night I had been thrown out of my home, I wasn't afraid of the cold, because I had built something stronger than fear. And even though I didn't know it yet, those thick sod walls were about to prove something remarkable when winter truly arrived. The first real winter storm came in the middle of the night. I woke up to a sound that made my heart jump. The wind was roaring across the prairie, so loudly that it felt like the entire world was shaking. The sod walls around me groaned softly as the storm pushed against them. For a moment I lay still in the darkness, listening. The small iron stove beside me had almost burned out, and the room had grown cold during the night. The only light came from the faint red glow of the last piece of coal inside the stove. Outside, the storm sounded angry. Snow slammed against the walls like handfuls of sand thrown by the wind. I slowly sat up, pulling the blanket tighter around my shoulders. This was the moment I had feared since the day I started building the house. My first real winter storm, alone on the prairie. For a few seconds, I wondered if the roof would collapse. After all, it was nothing more than branches, grass, and thick layers of sod. But the roof held. The walls held. I carefully opened the stove and added another piece of firewood. The flames slowly came back to life, spreading a warm orange glow through the small room. Gradually, the heat began filling the space again. That was when I noticed something strange. Even though the wind outside was violent and freezing, the air inside the house was still comfortable. Warm enough that I could breathe without seeing my breath. warm enough that my fingers slowly stopped feeling numb. The thick sod walls were doing exactly what they were meant to do. They trapped the heat inside like a giant blanket. Later, someone would measure the temperature inside houses like mine and say they often stayed around 64 degrees Fahrenheit, even during freezing storms. But that night, I didn't care about numbers. All I knew was that I wasn't freezing, and that meant I might survive the winter after all. The storm lasted 2 full days. Snow piled against the outside walls until it nearly covered the small window opening I had cut into the sod. When the wind finally died down and the prairie became quiet again, I pushed open the wooden door. At first, it didn't move. The snow had drifted high against it. I had to shove hard with my shoulder before the door finally broke free, sending a pile of snow spilling into the room. Outside, the land looked completely different. The prairie had turned into a white desert. Everything was buried under deep snow. Walking became slow and exhausting. Each step sank into the powder, forcing me to lift my legs high just to move forward. But the storm had also brought a new problem: food. Before winter arrived, I had managed to collect a few supplies: some flour, dried beans, and a little cornmeal. But those supplies were already running low. If I didn't find more food soon, hunger would become a bigger threat than the cold. I began walking along the creek each morning, searching for signs of animals. The creek hadn't frozen completely. In some places, the water still moved slowly beneath thin sheets of ice. Animals needed water, just like I did, which meant they would eventually come here. At first, I only saw tracks: small rabbit tracks hopping across the snow, a few bird prints near the water. It took several days before I finally managed to trap my first rabbit. I had never hunted before. But hunger is a powerful teacher. When I carried the small animal back to the sod house that evening, I felt both grateful and sad at the same time. But survival didn't leave room for hesitation. That night, the smell of cooking meat filled the tiny room for the first time, and it felt like the greatest meal I had ever eaten. Still, winter life remained hard. Every day followed the same quiet routine: wake up, light the stove, search for food, collect firewood, return before dark. The prairie was incredibly silent during winter. Sometimes hours would pass without hearing a single sound. No birds, no wagons, no voices. Just the wind moving across the land. Loneliness became my biggest enemy. There were nights when I sat beside the stove, staring into the fire, wondering if anyone in the world even remembered me. I thought about my mother often. I wondered if she ever walked past my old room and felt regret, or if my stepfather had already erased me from their lives completely. Those thoughts hurt more than the cold. One night, after several days without catching any animals, I sat on the floor beside the stove, with tears quietly running down my face. My stomach was empty. The wind outside had begun rising again. For the first time since building the house, doubt crept into my mind. What if the men in town had been right? But then, something strange happened. As I sat there in the quiet glow of the fire, I looked around the small room. The walls I had built with my own hands surrounded me. The roof I had tied together above my head protected me from the storm. The warmth filling the air came from a stove I had carried miles across the prairie. Everything inside that room existed because I had refused to give up. Slowly, my breathing calmed. The fear didn't disappear completely, but it lost its power over me. Winter continued its slow march across the prairie. More storms came. Some lasted hours. Others lasted days. But each time the wind howled and the snow piled high outside my door, the sod house stood strong. Inside, the warmth stayed trapped within the thick earth walls. Inside, I stayed alive. By the time spring finally began melting the snow, I had survived nearly 4 months alone on the prairie. 4 months of cold nights. 4 months of hard work. 4 months of learning just how strong a person could become when survival was the only choice. But something unexpected had happened during that winter. The girl who had walked away from her old home in fear was no longer the same person sitting beside that stove. Because somewhere between the storms, the hunger, and the long silent nights, I had discovered something important about myself. I wasn't just surviving, I was building a life. And soon, other people would begin to notice the strange little sod house standing alone near the creek. A house that no one believed a 16-year-old girl could build. A house that had stayed warm through the worst winter storms. A house that was about to turn my lonely story into something people talked about all across the prairie. When the snow finally began to melt, the prairie slowly came back to life. At first it was just small changes. The thick white snow that had covered the land for months began shrinking day by day. Patches of brown grass started appearing again, and the frozen creek beside my sod house slowly broke open as water rushed through it. For the first time in months, I could hear birds again. Their songs echoed across the quiet prairie like a reminder that winter had finally loosened its grip on the land. I stepped outside my sod house one morning and felt the warmth of the sun on my face. It wasn't strong yet, but after months of cold wind and snow, even a little warmth felt like a gift. Standing there, I looked back at the house. The walls were still strong, the roof still holding its shape under the thick layer of grass and dirt. From a distance, it still looked more like a small hill than a house. But to me, it was something far greater. It was proof that I had survived. 4 months earlier, I had walked onto this land as a frightened 16-year-old girl with nothing but a bag and $200. Now I stood there, stronger than I had ever imagined possible. Spring also meant something else. Soon people would start traveling the prairie roads again. Farmers would return to their fields. Wagons would begin passing along the trail not far from my land. And eventually someone would notice the strange little house built from the earth. It happened sooner than I expected. One afternoon I was collecting branches near the creek when I heard a sound that made me stop. Wagon wheels. The creaking of wood and the slow clopping of horses echoed faintly through the open prairie air. I climbed up the small hill near my house and looked toward the trail. A farmer's wagon was moving slowly along the road. As the wagon approached the area near my land, the man driving it suddenly slowed his horses. From where I stood, I could see him staring toward the sod house. He pulled the horses to a stop. For a moment, he simply sat there, studying the strange structure rising from the prairie grass. Then he climbed down from the wagon. My heart started beating faster. I hadn't spoken to another person in months. Part of me wanted to hide, but another part of me knew this moment was important. So I walked toward him. When the man saw me approaching, his eyes widened slightly in surprise. "Afternoon," he said cautiously. "Afternoon," I replied. He looked from me to the sod house and back again. "You live here?" "Yes." His eyebrows lifted higher. "In that?" I nodded. He walked slowly around the structure, examining the thick sod walls and the grass-covered roof. Finally he stopped and looked at me again. "You build this?" he asked. "Yes," I said quietly. For a moment he didn't speak. Then he let out a short laugh of disbelief. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "I've seen sod houses before, but never one built by someone your age." He stepped closer and placed his hand against the wall. "Solid work, too." After a moment, he asked something that surprised me. "Mind if I take a look inside?" I opened the door and let him step into the small room. The moment he entered, his expression changed. "Feels warm in here," he said. The stove wasn't even burning that afternoon, but the thick sod walls still held warmth from the sunlight outside. He walked slowly around the room, examining the walls and roof. When he stepped back outside, he shook his head with a smile. "You know," he said, "most men I know couldn't build something like this alone." That was the first time anyone had ever said something like that to me. Before leaving, he asked my name and told me his. Then he climbed back onto his wagon. "You take care out here," he said, before driving away. I thought that would be the end of it. but prairie towns had a way of spreading stories quickly. Within a week, another wagon stopped near the trail, then another. Some people came out of curiosity. Others came because they simply didn't believe the story they had heard. A 16-year-old girl building a sod house alone sounded impossible to them. But every time someone stepped inside, their reaction was the same. Surprise. The house stayed cool during warm afternoons, and warm during cold nights. One farmer who visited shook his head and said something I would never forget. "I've lived on this prairie for 30 years, he said, "and this might be the smartest little house I've ever seen." Soon, people started asking questions. How did I cut the sod blocks? How thick were the walls? How did the roof stay strong? Some farmers even asked if I could show them how to build houses like mine. For the first time in my life, people weren't looking at me with pity or doubt. They were looking at me with respect. Spring turned into summer, and life slowly grew easier. I planted a small garden beside the creek. Potatoes, corn, a few vegetables that could survive the prairie soil. The garden grew slowly, but it was enough to help me eat better than I had during the winter. Sometimes neighbors from nearby farms stopped by to trade food or supplies. Little by little, the lonely prairie didn't feel quite so lonely anymore. Years passed. The land around my sod house slowly changed. More farms appeared nearby. Fences stretched across the fields. New families arrived, looking for a place to build their lives. Eventually I built a larger wooden house not far from the original sod one. But I never tore the sod house down. I couldn't. Because that little house meant more to me than anyone else could understand. It reminded me of the hardest winter of my life. It reminded me of the nights when the wind howled outside and I wondered if I would survive until morning. And most of all, it reminded me of the moment I discovered something important about myself. The night my stepfather threw me out of the house, I believed my life had ended. I thought I had lost everything. But sometimes the worst night of your life becomes the beginning of your greatest story. Because being forced to leave that house had pushed me towards something I never would have discovered otherwise. Strength, courage, and the ability to build a life with my own hands. Even today, when the prairie wind blows across the fields in winter, that little sod house still stands near the creek. The grass on the roof has grown thick over the years, blending the house almost perfectly into the land. Travelers who pass along the old wagon trail sometimes stop to look at it. Some of them have heard the story. Others are simply curious about the strange house made of earth. But whenever I see someone standing there studying those old sod walls, I always smile quietly. Because they're not just looking at a house. They're looking at the place where a frightened 16-year-old girl learned how strong she really was. And that little $200 sod house is still standing strong, just like the girl who built it.